So here is a huge question. How does a brand new political party, completely surrounded by enemies, actually win a war that ends up shaping the entire 20th century? Well, that's what we're getting into today. We're going to dive deep into the Russian Civil War and try to figure out how the communists pulled off such an unlikely and frankly brutal victory. We'll be basing this explainer on a really fascinating historical analysis that breaks down all the key factors.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll set the scene, Reds versus Whites. Then we'll look at the Trotsky factor. After that, we'll dig into what we're calling the Red Fortress. We'll also break down exactly why the Whites lost, and then we'll wrap it all up with the final verdict.
All right, let's dive right in and set the stage for this absolutely brutal conflict. You've got the brand new Red Army on one side, and on the other, this kind of scattered collection of counter-revolutionaries that we call the Whites.
And this really gets to the heart of the puzzle, right? I mean, think about it. The Bolsheviks were in a seriously tough spot. They were besieged on all sides, fighting multiple enemies across this enormous country. So you just have to ask, how in the world did they pull it off? How did they win a war that led directly to the Soviet Union and changed, well, everything?
And we really can't overstate the scale of this thing. The source material makes it crystal clear. This was an unbelievably brutal war. We're talking millions of deaths, and not just from fighting. Famine just tore through the countryside. And of course, it's when the Romanovs were killed, ending a dynasty that had ruled for 300 years. I mean, the stakes were just astronomically high.
So where do you even begin to explain a victory like this? Well, for a long time, the go-to answer was pretty simple. It was all about one guy. Let's dig into that great man theory and talk about the Trotsky factor.
Okay, get this number, 65,000 miles. That's how far Trotsky traveled on his special armored train. To give you some perspective, that's like going around the entire planet, more than twice. He was just a total whirlwind, crisscrossing the country to rally the troops, lay down the law, and basically be the face of the revolution right there on the front lines.
Now, some historians will point out that maybe he wasn't a master military strategist, but that's kind of missing the point. The source material really argues that his true genius wasn't in battle plans, it was in motivation. He was an absolute master of propaganda and gave these incredibly powerful speeches. He could give his soldiers a single unified purpose, and that's something the white generals just couldn't do, not even close.
But it wasn't all just speeches and rallying cries. He was also a brilliant and maybe a little ruthless organizer. Look at these reforms. First, he knew the Red Army was full of amateurs, so he makes this incredibly risky call. Let's recruit 50,000 ex-Tsarist officers, the experts. But how do you keep them loyal? Well, that's step 2. He assigns a loyal political commissar to every unit to watch them and countersign every single order. And to make sure everyone followed those orders, step 3. Iron discipline enforced by the Cheka, the secret police. It was a tough, harsh system, but hey, it was a brutal war.
Okay, so it sounds like Trotsky was the whole story, right? Well, maybe not. What if his genius wasn't the only factor? What if the Bolsheviks were kind of playing with a stacked deck from day one? This is where we get to the big counter-argument. Let's move beyond the great man and look at the huge material advantage the Bolsheviks had. Let's talk about the Red Fortress. So this is what you could call the Bolsheviks' secret weapon. The territory they controlled, this red wedge, was basically the heartland of Russia. I mean, look at this list. They had the most people, they had the most factories for guns and ammo, they had the main railway hubs to move troops around, and they had the telegraphs and post offices to coordinate everything. It was like they were defending a compact, resource-rich fortress while their enemies were scattered all over the place.
And that geographical advantage brings us to this idea of a Pyrrhic victory for the Whites. A victory that costs you so much, it's basically a defeat. The White armies would go out and win these big battles, taking over huge chunks of territory. The problem? That territory was mostly empty. No people, no factories, no resources to speak of. So with every victory, their supply lines got longer and weaker. They were winning themselves into a corner. Their gains were totally hollow.
So we've established the Reds had these massive structural advantages. But that's only half the story, right? The other side of the coin is just as critical. We need to flip this around and ask, why did the Whites lose? Because, man, this is a story of just complete and total failure on pretty much every level.
I mean, this chart really says it all. Just look at the difference. Leadership, the Reds had one unified command. The Whites, they were split between 4 different generals who couldn't stand each other. Ideology, the Reds had a simple, powerful message. The The whites were a total mess. Some wanted the Tsar back, others wanted something else. They couldn't agree on anything. And maybe the biggest one of all, support. The Reds told the peasants, "We'll give you land." The whites offered, well, nothing. They gave the average person absolutely no reason to support them.
So at the end of the day, the whites were really their own worst enemy. They were fragmented in every possible way. Geographically, they were spread out all over the map. Politically, their leaders were more interested in their own egos than in winning. And ideologically, they couldn't offer anyone a compelling vision for the future. You can't win a war if you can't even tell people what you're fighting for.
Okay, so we've looked at Trotsky's role, the Reds' huge material advantage, and the complete disunity of the whites. Let's pull all these threads together now and figure out the final verdict.
In this chart here really visualizes the main takeaway perfectly. What's the biggest slice of the pie? It's that material advantage, the red wedge. That was the #1 factor. The next biggest piece? The total weakness and disorganization of the whites. And then you have Trotsky's leadership. And look, it's still a really important slice. You can't just ignore it. But it's clear that it wasn't the only thing, or even the biggest thing. It's just one part of a much bigger story.
So this is the bottom line. Was Trotsky's leadership a huge deal? Absolutely. His charisma and his organizational skills were critical. But, and this is the big but, that genius was amplified. It was made way more effective because he was working with all those material advantages we talked about. And he was up against an enemy that was just a complete mess. You could say his leadership was like the sharp point on a very, very heavy spear.
And that really brings us back to the central debate, the one big question that historians still argue about. So I'll leave you with this. Did the Bolsheviks actually win the war, or did the whites just lose it? It's a simple question, but thinking about it really gets to the heart of how history is made.